The scientific revolution starts now.
This is the Sci Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
So here's the thing about Bigfoot, and I think that this is a good kind of metaphor for other questions of openness in epistemology. About 20 years ago, when the internet was still a thing, the internet was like the blockchain of the 90s. It was going to be really big, right? And I was reading on the early internet, and someone on this early internet had created, I guess it's probably still there, Bigfoot.org, which was, basically consisted of everybody's Bigfoot stories, sort of in this kind of like penthouse letters, like you'll never believe what I saw, right? Kind of style. And, a couple of things, and I spent a few hours just like, kind of rabbit holing on this site. And two things really impressed me. One is that you read these stories and they didn't read like fiction. They really read like things that have happened to people, right? This was just like these were normal people who had extraordinary experiences, and there were a lot of them. And the thing that really kind of pushed me over one edge or another, though, was noticing that this Bigfoot.org site was categorized geographically. And so they actually had reports, very convincing reports of Bigfoot from all over the country, from all 49 states. Actually, I don't believe Bigfoot was found in Hawaii, but I wouldn't have been super surprised if it could have been found in Hawaii. But, Southern California, Virginia.
Well, they got the lava monsters over in Hawaii, of course.
The lava monsters, right? And so, I'm basically like, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow, these are really believable testimonials in a way, but like, could I buy like, a residual Gigantopithecus population, over the last 10,000 years? That's true. You don't find any killed by cars or anything, but over the last 10,000 years, they've evolved. Like their main skill is staying away from human beings, because otherwise, the Native Americans would have eaten them or something. So they're like really good at avoiding people. That's why you almost never see them, except you sometimes see them, and I could almost buy this relict population of apes, but I just couldn't buy it in all 49 states, and, and the District of Columbia. And, I don't know if the District of Columbia was represented, but I can imagine, Bigfoot, 3 a.m. Anacostia, but yeah,
That's a really good point, man. We if you look at the UAP reportings, there's also a map you can look at, and it's almost entirely inside of the United States and Europe.
Right.
Which is,
well, we're the most interesting country, right? I mean, we're the world leaders, right? So it makes sense that they would be primarily interested in us, whereas when you look at the appearance of like water demons and so forth, it's primarily in Africa. There's no map for that, but I'll
weird how that happens.
Right.
But
Weird how that
there's
happens.
Also another thing, which is how would you need to be presented evidence to actually buy that somebody did run into the Bigfoot?
I think, and this is another thing, it's like I had, there was an ex of mine who was into like spirituality and magic with a K, sort of magic with a K, although I don't think she used the K. And, she was sort of agnostic about whether the work she was doing, her spiritual work, had like any sort of physical reality, or like, are we all just living in a material world, or is there something more? She definitely had some experiences that suggested maybe there's something more here. And I said to her, I was like, let's talk about Bigfoot. I actually genuinely don't believe in Bigfoot. But the thing is, if you were to drive up in your Audi and open the trunk, and, in the trunk is a dead, like, Bigfoot, like, say an 8-year-old Bigfoot or something fits in the trunk, but big, right? And I look at this and I'm like, that is a dead big. You know, you were driving, you hit a Bigfoot, you put it in the trunk. That is a dead Bigfoot. Like very easy to go from like 0.01% possibility to 99.9. I just can't see how anyone could fake a dead Bigfoot. I mean, I'm not a primatologist or anything, but I look in there, the smell just is utterly horrifying. Like I touch it, it's sort of, you know, I mean, it's a dead Bigfoot, right? You know, and so, you know, then I've gone from, you know, a prior of, you know, 0.1% to 99.99%, because even if somebody could fake a dead Bigfoot, it's not you, right? So,
But to
so
raise
you know,
that level to the level of the population, you would have to drive that Audi with the dead Bigfoot in it to every house in America and let people come
Yeah.
into the streets and touch the Bigfoot.
Or what if
That's
someone
right,
published?
that's
What if it
right.
was published in Nature or something like that? Would you? Would
Yeah,
you buy it then?
nature. I mean, you know, it's like
Nature
it's like
Bigfoot.
the nature Bigfoot, right? And so, you know, anyway, I'm like, so I said to my ex, like, what are your Bigfoot experiences? You know, can you show me the Bigfoot in the trunk? And it's like, you know, you get all these things that are sort of like, they're suggestive. You know, you're like, wow, how could that have happened? And you know, I mean, my ex is not an idiot. Like, she knows all about the base rate fallacy or whatever, but she's still like, you know, I'm just like, I couldn't really quite be convinced, really, like, you know. And so, you know, there's a lot of things like, I mean, we recently had this wonderful epistemological experience of this new supposed superconductor, super interesting, like a great kind of a, you know, a feel good story in, like, you know, scientific history. And then you have other things like the whole COVID lab leak debate, which are not so much feel good stories, I guess I would say. And like, but like, you know, epistemology is like a serious problem in the world that we live in. It's like the hardest problem, you know, that exists. How do you know there's Bigfoot? How do you know there's no Bigfoot? Why haven't the resolution of UFO photographs improved as we all started carrying cameras in our pockets? You know, like, why has that not resulted in better UFO pictures, better Bigfoot pictures? Really hard to know. I mean, I don't have, you know,
Well,
I'm
there's an obvious
sure.
answer to that, right? Which is that the quality of the pictures is dissociated from material reality.
Yes,
I was going to say
because
suppression by the government.
yeah,
They're cleaning
actually,
up
they're
all the bodies,
modifying
man.
all their cell phones. You know, the reason, man, the reason you don't have any UFO photographs is because the software. That's not just a camera in your cell phone, man. That's software. And you know who
That's it.
puts that
Well,
software
there
in?
was that
The
controversy
government.
where
The government. The government. And if you actually
absolutely.
take a picture of a UFO, it'll come out blank, man.
Well, there was this crazy thing where Samsung was selling phones that it said could take really good pictures of the moon, and that was one of the
Oh, that's
selling points.
right.
And
AI.
then they found out that it was an AI completion of the moon because some guy like cleverly pieced it together, and so they just have that algorithm for cryptids.
Yeah,
in the reverse.
exactly. In the reverse. So basically, every time you take a picture of a Tasmanian tiger, all you see is a wombat. You know.
It was really funny. We had a septic guy come out to take care of our ailing septic tank. And the first thing that he did after he opened it up, he's like, I got to tell you guys about this new thing. It's called ChatGPT. I don't know if you've heard of it. And then he had a whole spiel about ChatGPT and how wonderful it was. And we had a really great conversation. And then it went into the direction of the Illuminati. And then it went into the direction of the New World Order. And then it concluded on giants in Afghanistan.
This is a very rural Oregon moment, I gotta say. And you know, my rural stint in COVID was out near Reno, and I definitely had some like Reno moments. You know, like it's real out there. You know, you wouldn't understand living in these cities.
It's a transition that somehow makes perfect sense to me, where you start with something that is perfectly reasonable and something that everybody has access to, but it is this portal to some next phase, right? Because when you can type into a computer anything that you want, and the computer basically speaks back to you, it gives you a full marketing plan, it tells you how to sell your septic tank business. There's this moment where you realize that you're standing on the precipice, the same way that the first sheep herder on the steppe to hear the toll of a bronze bell knew that something crazy had happened. Okay, so crazy
I
shit's
think
happening.
yeah. I mean, probably it was the bell maker that heard the toll of the bell first, but the
Well,
when
no,
the
I'm
sheep
saying that
herder
like the bell maker shows up with the bell and is like,
with the
yo, check
bell,
this shit out.
he's like, yo, check this shit out. You'll be able to hear your sheep from a long ways away.
I
And
mean,
the sheep herder is just like, whoa.
right?
I
And
can
he's
see it.
like, this is going to change everything. And so this guy is standing here and he has this piece of technology that he knows is going to change everything. And I think that that is somehow directly tied to his faith that there are giants in Afghanistan that were found by the US troops when they arrived.
Well, there's videos of it, for God's sake.
Videos of the giants.
I mean,
I mean,
that's the thing. That's like, but in all seriousness, like that's what complicates the hell out of epistemology is that people have access to incredibly convinced. Well, depending on your level of familiarity with deepfakes, like people are swayed by these things.
well, I mean, let's take a step back and kind of consider kind of the fabric of classical liberal epistemology, which is the marketplace of ideas. And the thing is, when you're basically looking at today's like internet from the very abstract kind of Victorian gentleman, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham kind of marketplace of ideas, and you take that sort of picture and you look at the internet today, it's like you're sort of going straight from like an Eleanor Roosevelt fireside chat to like a Black Sabbath concert, and you're just like, this is not like, what is this, right? The there's this whole idea of the marketplace of ideas is this sort of essentially evolutionary space in which the best ideas will outcompete the worst ideas. And and you can see this, like this effect is real, and you can see it. And it's like the people like working at whether the crazy Korean superconductor is a superconductor or at all, or it's just some like crazy Koreans who should have been listening to K-pop. And it seems to be some like crazy Koreans who should have been listening to K-pop, but it was an exciting moment. The rocks do float. I'm not sure, like that's some pretty powerful diamagnetism. You got whatever's going on there. Something's interesting, but it's not that interesting. So it seems, but you see this sort of real like market of ideas like really working its way out. And the participants in this market are people who actually like think for themselves, are like thoughtful, capable people. You have the deranged Russian lesbian cat girl chemist like Iris Alexandra. You had this whole like sort of like, very, I mean, this is the marketplace of ideas sort of as it's supposed to work. And then you basically see sort of, and then you're just like, yeah, like John Stuart Mill is right. We should all be classical liberals, man.
Hey everyone, if you are enjoying the work we do here at the Demystify Sci podcast, consider supporting the project so that we can grow it into a bigger and more powerful operation where we're able to get at deeper questions with bigger guests. For just a few dollars a month, you can get the episodes early, and you can join our roundtable on Sunday where we chop it up about how to make this a better project. You can also block off next April, the 6th and 7th, where we're going to be having our first Demystify Sci podcast conference. And we're going to have some incredible speakers, and we're also going to have a chance to really get together in person and tackle some of these issues and plan the next year. So check it out. The eclipse is also passing very nearby in Austin, Texas. So we'll be around for that on Monday, and we can check it out together. It should be really fun. If you don't have any money, that's fine. Just leave a comment down below. Come over to Discord. Give us your ideas. Check out our Facebook page. Get in touch and share the podcast with somebody who you think would like it. Back to the conversation with Curtis Yarvin.
And then you actually you go back into the Black Sabbath concert and you're just like, okay, what are the ideas now that we've really have in a world with no filters, no censorship. Okay, yeah, there's spasmodic attempts to do this. Even if there's censorship, whether there's censorship or no censorship, what dominates in the democratic marketplace of ideas among just the people as a whole, one brain, one vote, and you're just like UFOs, Bigfoot, RF Kennedy, and mayonnaise causes autism, and like it doesn't. I don't have any misinformation in your show.
Yeah, fuck, we just got
And
kicked off YouTube for that one.
Yeah. Mayonnaise is actually good for autism, guys, right? But yeah, you just get this, like, it's so obvious that basically anyone who sort of believes the democratic marketplace of ideas works is just like, you're just not even like, you're just like, it's like you've done so much DMT that it's like an eyes open hallucination moment. Like you can't even tell whether your eyes are open or closed. Like it's crazy to think that, okay, we're going to take this and then we're going to basically put this in charge of, let's say, the United States strategic nuclear deterrent, right? And this marketplace of ideas is going to decide when or when not to like nuke Russia, what to do with it. I mean, it's pure idiocracy, right? You can't actually imagine, the Athenian people in their assembly were actually in control of where the triremes went and what to do with the hoplites. They decided it would be a great idea to invade Sicily, and that was kind of the end of Athens, right? But again, when you compare the Athenian agora, and I have issues with the Athenians. Let's not forget they killed Socrates. But like, when you compare them as like a demos, a responsible demos, and then you go out and look at the like, just like the way ideas spread on Facebook, whatever sort of septic tank repairman like sites, you're just like, no way can we put this in charge. That would be insane.
I think that if you put the Athenians on Facebook or on Twitter, you'd get the exact same black morass of insanity. I think that there's something about...
I think it was, yes.
Like, sorry, there's something about putting people into a condition where there's none of the visceral blood and bone responses that we have in conversation that releases a demonic undercurrent that is terrifying. Because you have people on the internet and it's not the same as people in person. And there's this weird thing that Shiloh and I were coming across this for many months last year, where there was this almost apologist perspective where, oh, they do that online, but they're not like that in person. They'd never do that in person. They're really nice if you meet them in person. And
this is like kind of resulting in us, like we used to have avatars online on all the social media and stuff, and we decided to just go completely like use our names.
Face back.
Just be ourselves. Yeah. And like, I don't know, it was an interesting decision to make, but I think it was rooted in that to some extent.
Yeah.
It was like, cut the shit and just be real.
Yeah, there's definitely, there's, don't get me wrong, there's certainly a place for pseudonymity online, and there's a place for like online discourse in general. It can be done well or it can be done badly. In some ways, online discourse is a little like modernist architecture, though. You have to be really, really good to do it well, and normally it's done badly. And so,
we don't have a
it's
culture where people aim for good. Like,
sure.
We don't have a culture where, because you see that Jordan Peterson was probably the first person to get popularity where his bottom line platform is just, why don't you just do good? And it's really perplexing because he's categorized as being alt-right, and there's this entire downstream ideas pipeline of how taking care of yourself and getting strong is this far-right QAnon associated worldview.
Well,
where
and
the idea of doing good is just nonsensical almost.
Sure, and like, even Jordan Peterson himself had like huge problems handling the resulting fame. And the like, yeah, you can't like, he's just like, people look to Jordan Peterson and are just like, wait, you're saying this like unironically, right? And so you have this, you have this, and then Jordan Peterson, a friend of mine had this genius, who's a movie guy, had this genius Hollywood idea. Can I share his genius Hollywood idea with you? This is like every bad Hollywood idea, it's precast. This would be, the idea is for a film, a feature film, and it features Steve Coogan, if you know Steve Coogan,
Mm-hmm.
as Jordan Peterson,
Okay.
and then George Clooney as Hunter Biden, and they're together in a rehab in Serbia, and they break out and find life and love on the road, and it's called Bucko. But
Hell yeah.
I'd watch that.
I would see that in the theater for sure. IMAX that shit.
Everyone would. IMAX that shit. Everyone would. But somehow a great film like that, can't get made in today's state of the world. But so you have this like morass of, it's true that we're probably more ironic than the Athenian demos. I don't know. I mean, if you go to the Wikipedia page of all places for Athenian democracy, I noticed this a couple of years ago. I hope it hasn't changed. There's a quote there actually from a modern scholar who's like, the really interesting thing about Athenian democracy is that, there have been so many attempts in the centuries since to copy it. And yet every writer that we have who wrote anything about it in the time when it was actually happening was just like, this was a complete shit show. And and it's true that there's, sort of the attraction of this kind of malignant form of government, and you can sort of, it's very hard to sort of get anything that actually equalizes political power in any sense, but sort of the attempts to get there have not exactly been crowned with historical success, certainly not when you take sort of an outside view of them. And yet we sort of keep on LARPing this Athenian democracy. It's true that like sitting there, it was a crazy, because basically it was like the Athenian Agora was like, it was like the jury that could indict anyone, and like anyone could show up and be on the jury that day. And so you can imagine like the sort of just, horde of rabble. And probably there was a lot of like, when you get humans together in large groups, it's true that the isolation of onlineness creates a certain kind of dark energy, but like the sort of, hooting and hollering chimp behavior creates another kind of dark energy. And, so I imagine it was some pretty like sick stuff if you were like gonna witness this. Like, and so I don't know that we'd come away with a positive impression, but it's better than the Aztecs. Okay, better than the Aztecs, definitely.
But like, to what extent is that democracy that's failed right now versus the corruption of democracy? Yeah.
No, it's oligarchy that's failed right now, because basically, so I mean, it's for the, it's like, democracy isn't even, when you talk about, okay, democracy, one of the things that, one of the little brain teasers I give people to kind of twist their heads out of this is, I'm like, well, consider the words democracy and politics. And you'll notice that one of them has a very positive connotation and the other one has a very negative connotation, which is really strange because ostensibly they mean the same thing. And so if you basically were to say to like the average, resident of Portland, hey, let's put politicians in charge of the government, they'd be like, oh no, we can't politicize the government. Who would want to politicize the government? If you were going to politicize U.S. foreign policy, that would be very bad. But if you were going to democratize it, that would be very good, right? And you just sort of live within this weird twist of language. You're just like, what does that even mean?
Well, what it means is that politics is about propaganda and is about garnering attention, and it's about the black magic of getting people to believe in something and then to organize themselves behind it, while democracy is read as the ability to, without outside influence, reach into the minds of people to see what it is that they truly want. And so one stands for truth, the other one stands for
right,
manipulation.
But without outside influence, typically just means kind of maybe like without the other guy's influence.
No,
right? I mean,
I think I've like a lot of these conversations that you have in person come down to the fact that everybody agrees that the system is twisted up by the fact that there's a lot of money in it.
I don't agree with that at all. I don't agree with that at all. I think that's very far with the system being twisted up because of money. I think that's very like that's a sort of classic, one of the ways in which you have to sort of, I mean, understanding the political system that you live in is always like a fish trying to understand water.
Sure.
And so when you see there's a certain kind of rhetoric about sort of kind of competing systems in a sense, which often is kind of a LARP of something very, very old. And so there's a lot of rhetoric in kind of in the kind of the sort of American intellectual class about, you know, corporations corrupting the political process with, and what this is sort of a reflection of the way America worked like 120 years ago or so, kind of Gilded Age America, which was really very a lot like China. Like everything was very, very corrupt. Things got done extremely fast and were just like lubricated with like vast quantities of kickbacks. Politicians in these days are sort of stereotype of a politician, in some ways comes from, like Tammany Hall in New York, these like corrupt political machines. And so, when to answer my question about, why we have this sort of different concept of politics and democracy, I would go back to kind of the early 20th century when you had people who were essentially early progressives. I'm talking about people like Henry Adams, and who's the you know grandson of John Quincy Adams. These are sort of the American aristocrats of their time in 1900. Notice a couple of things. One is that they're the best and smartest people in the country. They're often educated in Europe. America is still a cultural backwater to a substantial extent before the First World War. And so they basically have this idea or develop this idea that essentially when they look at the government, they see it being run literally by, politicians, and the politicians were not statesmen. They were politicians. They did not actually have philosophies. They were just like corrupt people who, like third world politicians, essentially. They basically get into these jobs and, they're not really there to steal. Like they just sort of want the job. They want, they want to get elected. They'll say anything to get elected. And they basically look at democracy as it actually exists. And they say, as people have said, across the centuries, gosh, this sucks. And so they're basically like, what we would actually like is basically look at us. We're these like, intellectuals. We're professors. We have this like beautiful view of like history. We have science, which is coming on, at sort of tremendous speed. And like, it's just clear that having our countries run by these like just clowns and thugs and like criminals really is just not going to cut it in the 20th century. Right. And so, the idea of basically sort of progressivism with a small p was an idea of sort of a renewal and a kind of recentering of the American elite. And this sort of recentering of America around its university elites really bursts into full flower with the coming of the New Deal. And there are basically all of these kind of experts in government that come into the government. And basically, the idea of basically saying, we are going to put in these super big brained egghead people. And, the idea of having like professors set like public policy was like unheard of in this country in 1800. And instead, instead of having the government run by these these clowns, rubes, politicians, whatever. We are going to depoliticize government. We're going to have a government full of competent professionals who make policy based on not on myths and rumors and stuff you heard in your tobacco field and septic tank repairman stuff and giants on Mars. No, or in Afghanistan, I guess. We're going to have scientific public policy. And we're going to basically, yes, policy will still be set by a marketplace of ideas, but it's going to be a completely different little sterile marketplace of ideas in which basically only the best participate, and sort of we're going to have only the best ideas, we're going to have only the best people, and the people who come in the New Deal to make like Washington work are amazing. They're like startup quality people, they're like San Francisco people, they're like, it's this amazing, like the New Deal is like this giant startup government. It's an insane experience. And did you guys see Oppenheimer? You've seen Oppenheimer? And you see, I mean, it's like to all the like libertarians out there, like the most successful engineering project of all times, was Los Alamos, was the Manhattan Project, and that was a government project. But it was also a government project that was run completely like a startup, down to having like the technical co-founder and the non-technical co-founder, like Rose and Oppenheimer. Like that's just like straight out of the Silicon Valley textbook, right? And so, it was just this incredible experience. And so you have in kind of the mid-century this sort of flood of just like incredible people comes into the government. And of course, the US conquers the planet. I mean, let's not be bashful. Like, this is what we did. This is what our forefathers did. We conquered the planet. And, it's true that, at the time of conquering the planet, we expected the Soviets to be kind of our allies, or maybe even our satellites, but it turned out that they didn't want that. So we kind of had a Cold War, which meant we had basically two competing progressive, empires. I mean, basically since about 1930, the word progressive in United States political discourse has been equivalent to the word communist. My grandparents were American communists. They always used the word progressive. They would not even use the C word even to me. And so you have basically this
it's
kind of,
funny because I don't think that the reverse was true.
The reverse in what sense?
That the capitalists in Russia were not seen as the progressives.
Well, the capitalism and communism are closer than you might think.
I mean, just in the sense of
just like small background, Anastasia's family was escaped from Soviet Russia, so there's that.
When did they escape?
In 1990. So I was born in Chechnya, actually.
Really? Chechnya. That was quite a place. Are you actually a Chechen? You're not. You don't look Chechen.
No.
Yeah. No. I mean, Russia was like.
Well, no, I'm just saying that, like you said something really interesting, which is that the people that are inside of the Western American system that were proponents of communism were viewed as progressives, but I don't think that was the case in Russia, where the people that were against the communist system were viewed as progressives in the same way.
I would use I don't know how. I don't know Russian, obviously. So there's a couple of different things. There's the language there. Simply the word progressive is used, for example, by Teddy Roosevelt early on. But basically by about 1930, for example, when you'll see the word progressive used in the Venona dispatches, which are decrypted dispatches sent by various people interacting with the KGB in the US back, when they use the word progressive, they always mean a friend of the Soviet Union. They always mean a friend of the party or a friend of the Soviet Union, who may not necessarily, a fellow traveler, as we would say. Or if you read, for example, there's a magazine called The Communist, which is all very nicely archived on Marxist.org. The Communist was the official journal of the CPUSA, which was very influential in the 1930s. And so if you want to see what the American Communist Party line is in 1936, you can just go and read The Communist. And trust me, you will find the word progressive used there frequently enough that they probably had to replace the P keys on their keyboards, right?
But I think that the people who were fighting against Stalinism and communism were like resistance fighters inside Russia, right? And so it's a really interesting thing because you have people that are on the outside looking into Russia and taking on the mantle of this Russian.
Did your parents and grandparents consider themselves dissidents? Were they part of the Petersburg intelligentsia? Were they
No, I mean they were. My mom's from Siberia, my dad's from Kazakhstan, so they were like very far.
I mean, your mom refused to join the party essentially, and your dad's whole family seems to have been wiped out by the revolution essentially.
Yeah, so they were definitely on the outside of.
So within Russia, I mean, Russia's like, it seems like the 20th century in Russia is like centuries long, and what it was to be a communist in 1921 is such a different thing from what it was to be a communist in 1991, and the sort of the mood and the spirit of it is completely different. You get essentially, as when Stalin really breaks with the West and starts the Cold War after World War II, you already see these trends developing. So, for example, in early communism in the 1920s, there's sort of all of this kind of Western liberalism. They try free love, abortion on demand. Who is that? Oh God, I always forget this woman's name. She was like a friend of Lenin, a girlfriend of Lenin. She ended up as a ambassador to Finland, I think. Early Soviet, big proponent of free love, and so you have like the social connections. If you draw like the social graph connections between the early Bolsheviks and the West, you end up with people like John Reed, if you know the name John Reed. If you want to look at the history, sort of the transatlantic history of communism, there's a great film from the 1980s called Reds with Warren Beatty as John Reed. It's very realistic because it was made by Hollywood communists about basically Hollywood communists, and so what it meant to be a communist in the U.S. was very different always than what it meant in Russia. First of all, communism didn't come from Russia to the U.S. It came from the U.S. to Russia. Lenin is not a member of the Black Hundreds, right? Lenin in the sort of Westernizer versus Easternizer, like intellectual spectrum of Russia, Lenin is a radical Westernizer, and he has very good friends in the West. And he's, extensively supported in his rise to power and somewhat thereafter by Western progressives. And Lenin, in fact, has this relationship with Woodrow Wilson that is wildly generally conceived as hostile, but actually is sort of like the relationship of a very beta guy with like what we sometimes call a BPD bitch, a very a beautiful, attractive, and completely ruthless woman who is just like, like Lenin is basically was writing these speeches that are like screaming at Wilson, and basically Lenin is like, lick my boot, and Wilson is like, I will only lick half your boot. Lenin is like, you must lick the whole boot and the other boot too, you capitalist pig, right? And you forget that they're basically sort of competing to be leaders of the world progressive revolution. Woodrow Wilson is not a reactionary, right? Woodrow Wilson is the prophet of revolution. It's just a question of like sort of the tension between those forces of it. So to be a communist in America in the 1930s was to be upwardly mobile. My grandparents gained huge social mobility from joining the party. Essentially, the party, everyone cool in the 1930s was a communist in America. Like everyone cool. Like the exceptions, you don't really need a list of like the communists in America in the 1930s. Just assume that everyone significant is a communist, and then subtract the people who are anti-communists. And so, not that everyone's a member of the party, but everyone is like sympathetic. If you look, for example, at the American relationship to the Spanish Civil War, like again, you see just huge connections going from elite American society to the left side of the Spanish Civil War, and Americans who like supported Franco or fought for Franco, probably 5 of them, like just weirdos, and whereas nothing, the loyalist, the loyalist side in the Spanish Civil War was as like popular as like the frickin' Ukraine. Don't even start me on the Ukraine, right? And and so it was just this insane like thing. And to kind of get back to like the kind of the subject of epistemology that I wanted to go into earlier. So essentially you have this sort of movement of progressivism, which is like a movement for sort of the management of the state by the intelligentsia. It's like one way to think about the CPUSA in the 30s is like, imagine if you ever went to like a gifted school, maybe you're in gifted school, right? And you're in gifted school and you're like, what if all the gifted kids formed a political party and tried to take over the world? Like, and this was basically what the CPUSA was. This was the vibe, right? The vibe is we're just like better and smarter and cooler and we're going to win. And eventually, I would say it came true, not in that the party as an organized force won, because the CPUSA as an organized force really disintegrates in 56. But, sort of what happens to American communism from the 50s to the 60s is what's called the old left becomes what's called the new left. So Barack Obama, for example, very much a man of the new left. I'm sure he used the word progressive with a small p to describe himself only 60,000 times. Also, as we've recently learned, he's gay. And I don't know if you saw that interviewer with interview in Tablet with his biographer. So the gay Obama theory completely prevails. Like that was a obscure internet theory, and now it's confirmed as true. And
well, you got to absorb that demographic. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's just it's epistemology, right? I mean, who would have? I mean, come out and said in 2008 Obama is gay, and yet here we have his letters to his ex-girlfriend in which he writes, "I fantasize about making love to men every day." Now, it's possible that that was just a fantasy and he never did that, but like, I doubt in my heart. But in any case, so you have basically this epistemic, problem, and you've basically said, okay, we've sort of transformed, we've moved the leadership of this incredible machine called the United States of America, and we've defeated democracy. We've gotten politics out of government. We've basically created this like administrative state that's based on science and is above politics, which is bad, unlike democracy, which is good. And it's going to lead us into the 21st century with science-based public policy. And like,
and there's a lot of problems with that because
it didn't work out the way. Yeah, it didn't work out the way people expected.
I think that the reason that it doesn't work out the way that people expected is because people fundamentally misunderstood the amount of truth that you can get out of science at any given moment.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you were talking about
very much so.
third world politicians being essentially what politics was looking like, that sounded a lot like the academy to me too, where you have people who do anything to get the job and will chase whatever topics are hot.
That's right. Now, are you guys scientists? This is a science podcast, ostensibly.
We're classically trained scientists.
Yeah, we teach at the university still a couple times a week. Nothing crazy, but
what kind of science do you do, if I may ask? Is it social science?
No. I teach astronomy and astrophysics, just first year stuff. Anastasia teaches microbiology. But we have backgrounds in all kinds of stuff.
Shiloh did his PhD in biophysics, and I did mine in microbial electricity.
Lovely.
Yeah, but we're lucky because we're at this tiny little university, and they kind of let us do whatever we want. I don't really have anybody breathing down my neck, so it's kind of as long as that stays the way it is, then I'll be there. But
that's how it should be. Well, I dropped out of the PhD program in computer science in Berkeley. About 30 years ago, and
it seems like a weird thing to get a PhD in. Everybody that I've ever met,
science.
Yeah, like everybody that I've ever met that goes down that path gets about halfway down it and is like, "What the fuck am I doing?"
I got about a fourth of the way down it, and I was like, "What the fuck am I doing?" Maybe I was just so precocious, but so yeah, I mean, and so you basically watch this, I mean, there's so many. So many subfields of computer science, and some of them that actually make sense, but never mind. In mine it didn't. And in any case, like, so you did this thing, and you said we're going to give like control to science, and immediately, or maybe not so immediately, a couple of things become evident. The first one is the point that you mentioned, which is that the scientific method, as so defined, isn't really applicable to a lot of things. There's a lot of things where you can do maybe the controlled experiment on fruit flies, but on people, not so much. And so the problem is that when you have an epistemic tool whose efficacy is limited in certain domains, what's going to happen to you is that you basically start, the concept of looking for your keys under the lamppost.
100%.
There's a drunk out and he's dropped his keys, and the cop sees him and he's looking for his keys, and he's looking under in the light, shone by a lamppost, and but there's nothing there. And the cop is like, well, why don't you, are you sure you dropped your keys under the lamppost? And he's like, no, but that's where the light is, and so there's a kind of effect where people, go very quickly from science to scientism, and they basically very quickly run into problems like social science, where actually the methods of science don't work. And then they start basically sort of aping those methods, and they're doing essentially, there is no social science. There's like social cargo cult science, right? And so, and it's very dangerous whenever you have an epistemic system or an epistemic method that seems to work but actually doesn't, because basically people get really, really confident of it. They're like, okay, the Pope can speak to God. He's got a direct line, presses one button on his phone and he's in. He doesn't have to sit with St. Peter on the phone tree all day. So, when the Pope says something, it's like God says something and must be true. And then, the Pope is like, the sun goes around the earth. I know this is a caricature, but hear me out. Right. And then you're just like, well, the sun goes around the earth. And it's just like, it seemed to me that with a little proximal origin experience, if we could cut directly into like the science news, basically, somebody found a way to write a paper in Nature that said, well, this possibly could be a zoonosis, which means we came up with and then that turns immediately into definitely not a lab leak. We definitely didn't do this, guys. And you're basically finding this mechanism which you called nature, which you thought of as a really like truth machine. I mean, everything in nature is true. If nature says it, it must be true. Like nature got the same thing. They got the one button on their phone and they can talk to God, and like there's no phone tree, St. Peter, is not screening his calls, and then you're just like, actually, no, this process that gets paid, you see like the Slack chats, and you're like, no, actually, it turns out that this process that gets things into nature is like, kind of a human process. And then, but there's a lot of like scientists out there, who want to get their truth across, who are sort of thinking, if only nature knew, sort of the way people in the Soviet Union would be like, if only Stalin knew, or like, if only the Tsar knew, and
but it's a very human enterprise, right? Science is not an act of a guy in a white lab coat that is completely impartial and eyeball upon the world. And I think that was something that people really believed in, because I think that in general, at the beginning of the industrial science machine, I think the scientists were probably where all of the autists gathered. I think it was the people that really were not like the rest of humans. And so it was very easy to look at them and to be like, well, I mean, look at them. They're weird. Obviously, they're
just
not
nerds.
like us.
They're just nerds. They're only going to do nerd things, right?
Right. And nerds are somehow elevated and impartial and the best versions of ourselves because they're fully rational, divorced from their emotions. They will never have an emotion that clouds the way that they look at this. But social sciences tend to not attract the same sorts of people that would be attracted into engineering and chemistry. Even biology is like a softer realm of
even
minds.
engineering, even hard sciences today. I mean, computers, I guess I was in a fairly soft area of computer science, but, the thing that made me really decide I had to drop out of the program was realizing, because my parents worked for the federal government, and I was like, oh, I was a nerd. I was like, oh, time to apply to school again. But grad school is not like being an undergraduate. It's a job. It's not really being a student. And the thing is, part of that job is really building your network and being strategic and basically doing all of the things you're seeing the Proximal Origins authors do in that Slack chat. And they're basically just like, and what that system.
What is this Slack chat? You've mentioned this twice now.
You're really worth looking into if you're interested in epistemology. So basically, when all of these virologists realized that they'd started an epidemic that was going to kill 20 million people and cost $35 trillion, they're like, wow, we really wish we hadn't done this. And so they basically started to Fauci and Jay Farrar of the WHO kind of got all the leading virology thugs in a room together and are like, you are going to write a paper that says we didn't do this. And they're like, you're going to write a paper that says we didn't do this.
They were like, hell yeah, we're going to be in Nature. They're like, I'm going to publish in Nature finally.
Right. Actually, after they release this purely fraudulent paper, and then it becomes like the most linked to paper. And then later in the Slack chat, they're like, 10-year secured, right? They're just like, it's sort of very human in a way, like very sad story of just like sort of completely normal. These guys don't even seem like that smart. And, the research they're doing is completely fucking useless. It's like stamp collecting if the stamps were like, viruses. And then you just like made the viruses worse. So you could basically see, wow, this virus could get worse. I mean, the whole research program of like, the Predict grant, the whole research program that created COVID was sort of like, and people complained about this at the time. Like there were people even warning, like with any major accident, you find like absolutely clear warnings of this accident years before, but basically,
they did this with the flu really quite openly. They basically made it hyper transmissible by doing the experiments with ferrets. And I think that the scientists responsible for that had to go underground for a while because there was just so much blowback when it was published.
This was Ron Fouchier in the Netherlands, and he was actually one of the ones that was putting this Proximal Origins paper, in place behind the scenes. He wasn't working with the bat coronaviruses, but they were basically doing the same thing. It's like you come home, from shopping or something, and you find like your 10-year-old son in the kitchen, and he's setting fire to the curtains, and you're like, Henry, why are you setting fire to the curtains? And he's like, it's science, Dad. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, as you know, a lot of fires start in the kitchen, cooking accidents, hot grease, whatever. And what if some grease came off the stovetop and lit the curtains on fire? Could we get out? Could the dog get out?
I mean, to be fair, that's a good question to ask. And then to be like, which materials are more flammable? Should we have them out of polyester?
Exactly.
What fire?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what if there were some stuffed animals in the kitchen? Right? And you're just like, and so the thing is, if you kind of step back in terms of epistemology, the problem that science, that there are some areas to which science is not applicable is like, okay, fine, we basically instantly got this like crop of like social scientists that told us that the way toward like social peace and happiness was that laws should not be enforced. And then we got like everything turned into a crime scene in the 1970s because of these new, this new science of criminology that says that, man is inherently good and should never be punished, right? And so you have basically, I mean, people forget that in 1950, you can walk anywhere you want in New York City at any time of day or night. Certainly in Portland. Oh my God. Right. And so you basically have, I mean, people are like, oh, well, crime has almost returned to 1960 levels. It's true, but in 1960, people were like, oh my God, juvenile delinquents, crime wave everywhere. What is happening? Like, this is about to be like, 1960, or only like 6 years before like Death Wish, Charles Bronson, like New York City, right? And so you have all of these social policies that are really intended to like uplift the underclass, or what is not quite an underclass, then uplift the working class and basically merge it with the middle class. And instead you get this creation of this just insane feral underclass that no one could have imagined existing. Like, and
But weren't they running drugs into the inner city? Like, wasn't this
that's later.
that
That's
is
much
later,
like,
but
like,
there's
no,
an
that's
arc
not.
in which it's connected, and I don't think that these things happen in a vacuum. And I think that
I
it's
think that
really
they
unwise to look at them as happening in a vacuum, because we live in an interconnected web of events where
we do
one
live
thing
in
getting pulled on here is also getting pressurized by something that's happening somewhere else. And those two things combine together later to create the thing that we see. And so if we're not careful about the cause and effect analysis, we can create a story that is like the Bigfoot
yeah.
story. There's a weird
there
smell, and
there's
it's not like a
there's
rotting corpse of a pig. It's Bigfoot, you know?
there's definitely like there's a lot of like, to parse the history of, I mean, the history of the 20th century is fascinating. No one has written it yet. I'm not sure anyone can really write it yet. In some ways, it's so like, you just,
Yeah,
when
like
you
at
go
what point
back,
is the story over? Like where do you like
it,
place the marker of, okay, so this is the things that we're going to explain, and like we live in a moment
I
now that's
I
no
think
longer influenced by it?
I would say that, like, it, when people sort of question their history, they often have this like starting date. Well, just everything before that happened, just like it says in Wikipedia, but then the CIA started running drugs into the inner cities or whatever. And I'm just like, no, right? Like, really, actually, you can go and read the Wikipedia page for the American Revolution, and I can tell you a story of that war, which is completely different, and like and which no one talks about, and I think which is much truer than any of the stories that, any of the narratives that you get. The facts are all the same, but the narratives,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that if you basically want to go back to a period in history in which contemporary historians can study that period without any kind of bias from their own time creeping in, because they just don't have a dog in that fight. And if you want to go back in Anglo-American history to a period when that's true, I would say that you're going back roughly to the early 16th century. I would say that sort of once the Reformation, in the period of the Wars of the Roses, I'd say that you can really write objective English-speaking history. Once the Reformation and the Tudors and stuff starts to happen, I believe that actually when we study Elizabethan England, we are already looking at that through a lens of modernity. And the like and so it's just like
Why do you
the
attribute that to the Reformation?
because the Reformation, because you clearly have a dog in the fight. When you think about the Reformation, you're clearly thinking about it from a cultural tradition which is on the Protestant side. And so you basically are going to go in the direction of like Black legend, as they call it, mythology, and you're going to go in sort of an anti-Catholic direction. And that's like deeply rooted in all sorts of like kind of folk perspectives of like English history. Like, you're never going to be able to see like the reign of Mary Tudor, for example, through Mary Tudor's eyes. That's very difficult. And whereas it's very easy to see like Bloody Mary from the perspective of like, oh, Bloody Mary is like Hitler in the 16th century or something, right? It's very easy to pull that, and it's very hard to see what the world looks like inside Mary Tudor's head. Whereas, for example, I was just talking to someone the other day about the weird regime of Edward VI, and I was like, Edward VI, he was, Henry VIII's only surviving son. He was a nerd. He was very learned. He was educated by Calvinist theologians from an early age, and he died, I believe, at the age of 16 from tuberculosis. But he had this strange period of like 8 or 9 years when he was the king of England, but he was a child, but he was like a radical Protestant child. And so I was telling someone the other day that this was really our kind of first historical experience with what we now call wokeness, because essentially you had, Calvinism was essentially a radical leftist faith at the time, and these like guys kind of surged in, these like really, sort of Reformation Renaissance guys who were going to remake everything, kind of surge into power, and they basically start like, ripping all the ornaments out of the churches and shit. And Henry VIII, having already, of course, destroyed so much of the infrastructure of Catholicism in England, but Henry VIII was not really doing it for like ideological reasons, but these guys were ideological. And so they basically, this is sort of the reign of Edward VI, who then dies and is replaced by Mary Tudor, who's replaced by Elizabeth. The reign of Edward VI is kind of the founding moment of this kind of, Puritan attempt to kind of build God's kingdom on earth. And so you see echoes, of course, the Puritans are Calvinists. You see echoes of this, the reign of Edward VI, for example, in Boston, in 17th century Boston. Shakespeare is complaining about the Puritans in like his like late 16th century plays. Shakespeare, very, very, I'm an Oxfordian, which is a whole separate subject, but like very reactionary writer. There's not a hint of sympathy for democracy in Shakespeare. And so you already have this kind of separation between the English kind of right-wing kind of Tory tradition, and then New England is this colony of like radical leftist extremists. You have the Commonwealth period where, again, the Puritans are in charge in England and just like make a holy mess of things. And, America is, of course, this Puritan colony. Cromwell actually considered migrating to America. He didn't, but some people came back, were involved in the English Civil War. So how's an American going to write about the English Civil War without understanding that sort of you have a side in that fight? And then, the sort of the connection between the Puritans, sort of, if you kind of follow, like, what is the ideology of Harvard, down to the present from 1636, you're basically seeing what Germans call the Leitkultur, the leading culture of the American system. And so, Harvard becomes Unitarian. Unitarianism is a branch of Puritanism. And when you look at basically Unitarian Universalists today, you might notice that they're all progressives, right? Like there's a reason for this, right? And so, that historical kind of connection, or that historical thread running through the American elite, like right to the present, that's like really very easy to trace from Edward VI to Barack Obama, right? And like that's the, sort of, maybe there's some good things about that tradition, some bad things about that tradition. It's the tradition within which we live. So, for example, to say that there's something un-American about like the way Barack Obama thinks, could not be more untrue. Like this is the real, this like redneck, gods and guns stuff is the real, like, that's not the real America. The real America is Barack Obama and like, basically Boston liberals. And so, like that's a truth which is not necessarily helpful to the kind of the opponents of this system. But the thing is that, sort of religious oligarchies and the governance of America have been a thing that goes together for a very long time. And, especially when you're talking about the social sciences, you're just like, well, you're sort of seeing a religious mindset creep into those. It's much harder. The thing with, especially like astronomy, the neat thing about astronomy is that astronomy really has no political implications.
That's
You
why I
know,
love teaching it. Yeah.
which is great because the thing is, if you look at like Soviet astronomy, perfectly good astronomy, Soviet physics, perfectly good, Soviet economics, Soviet like psychology, Soviet social science, not so great, right? And so basically it's like, to sort of simplify what happened, essentially you had this idea that, okay, we're going to take this marketplace of ideas, which is the ideas of the nerds, and where these nerds are like little scientists puttering around, and they all have their own opinions, and they, if we take a crowd of these nerds and try to have them create a community where they can convince each other of their like nerd shit, whatever nerd shit out of that comes out of this will be like the best and most nerdiest and most good stuff. And this seems like a reasonable way to basically govern the world. And what they it's like they basically took this pristine, beautiful thing, sort of the abstract university full of all of these smart people, etc. And then they just sort of plugged it in to power. And they're like, okay, we'll plug the power into that. And what they missed when they were doing that is that you can't really create like a valve or a diode for power. And so they connected like the unpolluted mind of the university to like the sewer of power. And what they find is that sort of power came up in the reverse direction and started polluting the unpolluted university.
Mm.
And so it sort of created, essentially, when you had this marketplace of ideas that was going to evolve the best ideas, suddenly the best ideas maybe aren't just the truest, maybe they're the ideas that can get the most funding. Maybe, for example, your idea of, oh, bat coronaviruses are a problem, mutated bat coronaviruses are a problem, bat coronaviruses with furin cleavage sites could be a real problem. What if there was a pile of stuffed animals in the kitchen, right? And so you get these virologists, like the only reason why virology gets a bunch of money is to protect people from viruses. And suddenly you've created this world where you're essentially paying them to inflict viruses on people instead. And like you basically, and so you have this like scientific mechanism. It's not there to evolve truth. We actually don't need to learn anything about bat coronaviruses like until we start getting them. And the best way to is just stay as far away from them as possible.
I mean, some things are just interesting, though. Like I think
some things are just interesting, but these people are not motivated. Like
that, I agree with that.
Once you're within like the funding structure and like you're within the world of big science, I mean, you guys may be exceptions, but it's really hard to work on stuff just because it's interesting. I mean, I basically did all of my
creative about it. Yeah,
you have to be creative.
Well, you can have a bread ticket on the side too, like. What we did in my lab was like essentially have projects that were interesting, and we'd fund them with like kind of, I hate to say, like bullshit propositions to the Defense Department or something like, hey, you can use this technology, even though we're like, there's no way they're going to use this technology.
There's no way, right, but, exactly. That's the way. So much is done that way. I mean, my way of doing, the only interesting computer science I ever did was basically I like dropped out of school and made some money and like did my own shit, and that was much more. I could never have done those things in the academy, right? And never, and the like. And so you basically have, by saying we're going to put these scientists in charge, you actually at a very fundamental level like corrupt the science itself. You create, basically, let's take climatology. Like climatology in 1950s, like weather nerds, right? But once basically these weather nerds realized that, hey, maybe we could sort of see there being like a weather problem that would cause people to have to move trillions of dollars around. Suddenly, it's like basically you have a climate model and it says that climate sensitivity is low, and the Arrhenius effect is logarithmic anyway, nothing to worry about. Your climate model is basically saying we climatologists don't need a lot of funding. Guy down the hall, climate model is like, oh my God, the planet is going to literally boil. Like, who do you think gets the grants, right? And so you've basically created a Darwinian incentive in the marketplace of ideas, which is totally contrary to the pursuit of truth. And so you have basically, when you put science in charge of power, you basically created a fundamental conflict of interest among scientists that can't be avoided. You also created like a centralization of like funding sources, because one of the, when science was actually like a community of people with their own separate opinions, they could have separate opinions because they had separate funding streams. There were a lot fewer scientists, and they were just funded by like weird, rich perverts like Jeffrey Epstein. Like Epstein's, like, it's sad what the many things are sad about the Epstein thing, but he was basically, in a way, trying to fund science the way it was funded in the 19th century when we got all this good science, right? And
I mean,
and
a lot of
so
those, a lot of the OGs of physics were just independently wealthy. They're all like freaking barons and stuff. Like they didn't need the
many
money.
such cases, or
and if they weren't, like, they were physicians or lawyers, or they had
reverends, and the English Anglican curates, did a lot of good work, right? And so they had that independence. And the thing is, when you're a scientist in like grant world, like, I was talking to a guy who's a quantum computing expert, and I said something string theory, and he's like, you have no idea how bad it is. He's like, there are entire string theory conferences that are not actually about string theory. They just have to say it's string theory in order to get the grants, right? And so you have actually like this brilliant idea of, let's put the scientists in charge and like get rid of the corrupt politicians, all this stupid, nasty democracy stuff. Let's put the scientists in charge. Let's have an oligarchy of the few, the expert, the merited, the scientific. And what you got is this regime that doesn't even seem to make particularly good scientific decisions.
Well, because I think that what we've done is we've mixed up the idea between people that just generate data and people that are scientists. And so if you go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, there was the emergence of something called scientific management. And scientific management was the idea that you could show up to a factory, you could look to see how much time it would take to make each part, and then you could create these frameworks for how fast and efficient an assembly line would need to work in order to be at maximal efficiency, and then you could study where inside of your system you were having inefficiencies in order to boost production and make your factory run better. Okay, so that's not science, that's engineering. But the misuse of science as an engineering approach is, I think, where a ton of this comes from. Because when you have an institution that is focused on producing technologies, when you have an institution that is focused on producing goods, when you have institutions where everybody who's writing a grant says, I worked in a microbiology lab and we used a human pathogen in order to do our experiments. And so every single grant was like, we need to understand this human pathogen because it's important in cystic fibrosis and it kills people. And if we can understand it, we can prevent them from dying. But we were a basic biology lab. Like, we were so far from clinical applications that this was just the indulgence statement.
You're just lying.
Indulgence statement. It's not. It's a lie in the sense that you're not focused on it. But technically, if you find something, then maybe. And so, fine.
We did the same thing in computer science. Actually, that's really
exactly.
Turned me
You're
off.
like, we'll be able to build systems that can monitor every single person on Earth at all times, and we promise that we'll have it by next year. But the point is that there is a terrible, terrible mistake where science is the process of understanding. And engineering is the process of manipulating data to get a desired outcome.
Or manipulating some apparatus.
Or some apparatus, something. And so basically...
It's actually crazy if you think about it, how few people... Like, if you ask someone... Like, there's institutions that are literally called the Institution of Science and Technology, and 99% of people have no idea the difference between the two. And even the academics who are operating these institutions, like, you're like, why do you have two names there? You're doing the exact same thing in every single lab. You're trying to advance something that has some defense application or biomedicine application.
Sure.
And it's like, it's completely gotten lost what science even really is.
And so we've stopped calling it natural philosophy, but science really is natural philosophy because it's looking at the world and it's asking metaphysical questions. And it's not the same thing as making policy decisions, because that's a moral question.
and that's a moral question, and it's often it's a question that involves morals. It's a question that involves wisdom. Even actually, one of the things that I've seen is that basically people get so focused on the scientific method being the inductive method. I have to go in a minute, by the way. People get so focused on the scientific method being the inductive method that they even neglect deduction and logic in favor of like induction, which is just like, from a philosophical standpoint, totally crazy. And they're just like, no, you reasoned this. You can't reason it. Where's your data? Where's your evidence? We don't do reason here. What is this reason, right? You need evidence, right? And it's just this like, you basically, I mean, yes, science is wonderful. It's given us all these great 20th century toys, right?
Engineering has. Science has probably done very like I really think that's I know you don't have time for this discussion.
Yes, but
this is a discussion that I think is completely underdone in the world, and I think that people mistake the role of science, and I think that is a huge component of all of this, because science isn't what people think that it is. And people misuse that term regularly. And so when you point to science and you're like, science did this, and it's like, no. Our deep misunderstanding of the art of science and the confusion of it for technological advancement is what has done this.
Before you go, if you have time, can you point us towards some solution path at all?
Well, I mean, I'm a monarchist, of course, and so, I mean, it's called the Royal Society for a reason.
Who would you put into the monarch position? Do you have a preference?
I would say that, just in terms of, Patrick Collison did this thing. Do you know the name Patrick Collison? He's the Stripe founder. He did this thing for COVID that he called like fast grants. And he found a couple of interesting things out of his fast grants. One of them was that he asked where he just allocated grants the way venture capitalists do. Like, I'm just going to talk to you for 15 minutes or something. Right. And what he found, one of the questions he asked the people who received these grants is, if you could work on anything you wanted, as opposed to the things you're funded to do, would you change what you work on? And like 70% of these scientists said yes. And so, I think that basically our science system sort of is very worried that it's doing a lot of useless science, like institutionally. And so it has all of these insane accountability measures, which are meant to basically prevent it from wasting money, but essentially cause it to waste money. And so actually, I literally have had computer science funded by venture capitalists, and it's an insane process because they have no idea what you're doing. But I think that's actually much better than peer review and peer funding, because that's basically what gave us COVID.
And so who would you put in the position of monarch as a monarchist?
I would love, let's just go with Patrick Collison. I think he'd be great. So no, I'm sure he would totally reject this statement.
Well, what's to prevent like a guy like that from just getting corrupted by the power himself, or getting
because
swamped
actually
by the corporatocracy?
It's not power that corrupts, it's the division of power that corrupts. Like, what prevents like Tim Cook from being corrupted in his power over Apple, right? Does Tim Cook take like kickbacks to like put the wrong camera chip in the, like, actually, corruption is a matter of conflicts of interest. And as you get closer to a more absolute monarchy, you see fewer and fewer conflicts of interest.
We can have you back to unpack this. It was really good.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. All right. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for coming by. Bye, everybody.